Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was listening to the comments by the Honourable Dr Nick Smith about what a great bill this is. Oh, that it were so. The New Zealand Herald only a few days ago described this bill as yet another grudging half measure from the Honourable Dr Nick Smith. And, sir, it's hard to disagree. It's hard to disagree with that verdict. And I'll come back to Dr Nick Smith, but before I go any further, sir, I want to quote the Children's Commissioner, Dr Russell Wills, who is someone whose word I place great store by. He came to Parliament to submit on this bill, pointing out that New Zealand hospitalises around 42,000 children every year with preventable diseases of poverty. Many of those are directly related to cold, damp, mouldy homes. Dr Wills told Parliament that the standards in Nick Smith's bill that we're debating tonight are inadequate. And he said, "Government made a promise to New Zealand children, we will make your house healthy." And 3 years on from that budget promise, this bill, Dr Wills said, will do little for children living in cold, damp, mouldy housing. It is, the Children's Commissioner said, a wasted opportunity and a broken promise to our children. So, sir, I invite the House to reflect on those words from Dr Russell Wills, the Children's Commissioner. Let's talk about the problem that this bill purports to solve. 42,000 hospitalisations every year. In fact, the latest research from Otago University, the team under Dr Philippa Howden-Chapman that have done world-acclaimed public health research on these issues, they estimate actually that the latest figures indicate at the rate of hospitalisation is more like 50,000 per year. What's the consequence of that? Generations of young New Zealanders growing up with permanent health defects. Bronchiectasis, a permanent hardening of the lung tissue that leaves the people who have it with lifelong respiratory disorders and premature death. Epidemic rates of asthma, rheumatic fever, I could go on, but there's a host of conditions, respiratory and infectious diseases, that we should never even see in New Zealand in the 21st century. Many countries in Europe haven't seen these diseases since the Second World War. And so many of them are closely linked with poverty, overcrowding and cold, damp, mouldy houses. Yep. So, Nick Smith, after obfuscating, denying, diverting for so many years, finally brought this bill to the Parliament. And he obviously thinks that we should be celebrating in the streets tonight. Well, we're not, sir, because it is, as Russell Wills said, a missed opportunity. There are two primary defects in this bill. One of them is that it has nothing to say about heating. And it's the simplest thing for anybody to understand that if you insulate a cold, damp house, it is still a cold, damp house. And while it might make it cheaper to heat that house, the insulation might make it cheaper, that's not much comfort for people if there is simply no affordable, modern heating source in that house. And we also know from the research that there's a big problem with low-income families relying on unflued gas heaters, which are a health hazard, expensive and inefficient forms of heating. And what commonly happens actually is all the members of a family will crowd into one room in the winter to try to stay warm together, and to avoid the expense of heating the whole house, they'll only heat one room. That room then becomes a petri dish for infection. So that's the first defect. The bill has nothing to say about heating standards or ventilation, for that matter, the other really important thing in preventing mould. But the second big defect in Nick Smith's bill that the Select Committee, by majority, has failed to address. And I want to stress, Sir, that the Labour, Greens and New Zealand First members strongly argued that the loophole in Nick Smith's legislation standards should be closed. The proposed standards exist in draft regulations which have been released alongside this bill. And what they say, Sir, is that if a house has been insulated to the 1978 building standard, which would be insulation this thick, then under Nick Smith's bill, it does not need to be upgraded to the modern 2008 standard, which is insulation this thick. So this is Nick Smith's 1978 standard that he is legislating with this bill that will allow, in his own words, hundreds of thousands of houses in New Zealand that have insulation that could be 20 or 30 years old to this standard. They won't have to upgrade to this modern 2008 standard. Now, I find that unbelievable. I find that unbelievable in a bill that purports to be about improving the quality of New Zealand housing, that the Minister Nick Smith is legislating that to allow hundreds of thousands of New Zealand houses to continue with this redundant 1978 old-fashioned insulation standard. Now, one submitter after another, public health organisations, paediatricians, community organisations, the insulations who do the retrofitting work all around New Zealand, community energy groups, they came along to Select Committee and told us that was the most ridiculous thing to do. And yet the National Party members, supported by their minister, voted to keep this loophole in the bill. And it's a real shame. I want to talk about something about a matter that the minister addressed in his speech that needs to be, the record needs to be set straight. Nick Smith is fond of crowing that the national government has insulated 300,000 houses as if this was their idea and their initiative. And he likes to point out that the last Labour government insulated 50,000 retrofits. Now, the truth is, Mr. Speaker, that the whole idea for retrofitting houses and rental properties, providing subsidies and insulating them and providing a modern heating source is something that was developed under the last Labour-led government. And I want to pay tribute to Jeanette Fitzsimons, the then Green Party co-leader, and David Parker, who was the Minister of Energy under the last Labour government. And they decided that not only was insulation important, but a clean heating device was important. And with the help of New Zealand First, Greens and Labour, they legislated in, under the emissions trading scheme legislation, for a $1 billion fund in the ETS Act to be used over the period to 2024 for improved energy efficiency and clean heat retrofits. $1 billion to be spent insulating houses from the period through to 2024. That was legislated. But what happened when National came in? They abolished those provisions.
Why?
They gutted the ETS.
Why?
They let wealthy farmers who were responsible for producing 50% of the carbon emissions that this country is responsible for. They gutted the ETS. They got rid of this provision. And then what did they have to? Then they had to scramble some money together to fund the subsidy program. And so what they did was they backed millionaire farmers, chopped up the scheme that would have put hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders into warm, dry homes. They repealed that fantastic scheme, and their inadequate substitute, which we see here tonight in this bill, doesn't include a clean heating device. And so that is a travesty, and Nick Smith should stop rewriting history and acknowledge actually that if the ETS scheme had not been gutted and these provisions for clean energy home retrofits had not been abolished, then far more New Zealand homes would have been retrofitted and far more children would have been spared the unnecessary hospitalisation and disease that are caused by these housing conditions. Research by Otago University showed recently that insulating to the 2008 standard would cut emissions by about 3,000 children, sir. Under Nick Smith's...
I'm sorry to interrupt the member, but his time has expired. Members, order. I'm glad you're sorry, cousin. Members, with Dr Nick Smith calling for a point of order, the tape didn't pick up that I had asked, had informed the House that the question is that the motion be agreed to. So I now do that again.
Mr. Speaker.